Dune Spice Wars remains one of the best early access titles, holding on to what it does the best, but also blowing me away over the last few months. I jumped into the game having not played for a while, and I was struck by just about everything, and it's not hard to see why. There's a multiplayer, of course. We covered that back in, I think, June of last year. In October, it received an accessibility update, great for some, although maybe you might be thinking, oh, okay, cool, what else has it got? Well, we're staring down the barrel of a third game mode, stacking on top of course, the original Battle for Arrakis, 4 factions vying it out, and now a Canly duel has also entered the mix since the last time I covered Dune Spice Wars. So I thought, why don't I jump into a duel, somewhat aggressively, and also somewhat out of practice, and in this video, we're going to not only play a game of Dune Spice Wars, the fantastic real-time strategy early access title that released from Shiro Games last year, but also talk about just how much Dune Spice Wars has changed in the last 4 months, because out of all of the games that I cover, all of the updates and releases, the strategy titles that you've seen here on the channel, Dune Spice Wars has to be one of, if not the, most regularly and most impressively updated titles. Now granted, it's early access, but boy does it deliver. Now, if you're unfamiliar and you haven't followed my previous coverage, let's just quickly address what Dune Spice Wars is. It's a real-time strategy game with real 4X elements as well. It tries to blend those two subgenres. Made by Shiro Games, the developers of Northgard, and set, of course, inside of the Dune universe, where you lead one faction to control, dominate politically, or however you please, over the planet of Arrakis, harvesting its spice along the way. And I can confidently say that as somebody who went into it with no previous exposure to the Dune franchise or the Dune universe, I was left feeling actually pretty happy and at peace. It was an easy game to come into, and the fact that I didn't have knowledge didn't prevent me from experiencing anything. Although granted, I did go into it as a strategy game player, so I had some experience behind me in that respect. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, Dune Spice Wars has received so many updates. We got multiplayer last year, a new house to play, and many other quality of life changes. Since the last time I covered it, and at the end of 2022, it received even more updates, the Air and Sand update, as well as the Line in the Sand update. And these ones brought not just changes to accessibility, for example, as was added in October, but really core gameplay changes, just like every single other major patch has delivered. This time bringing a lot more diversity to units, particularly stronger ones and in the later game, as well as so many more key changes to this wonderful little strategy game. In fact, the Air and Sand update was so significant, it really was a game-changing update. The new units provide all sorts of interesting features. I'll put a couple up on screen now. Obviously, House Harkonnen, the one I'm playing at the moment, you can see gets this massive frigate that can also pump out small but powerful little flying drones, as well as an aircraft with AoE attack, because of course the theme here is all about the air. Take a look at the smugglers, massive behemoth of a unit, supplying and healed ground units in a large area around it, as another example. They really decided to take the game into a new dimension, and that dimension, of course, was the skies. It was in the name of the update, the Air and Sand. Every faction received 2 new flying units, and as you can tell by those descriptions earlier, or those examples I should say, it was generally a fast ship, smaller, more mobile, and then a huge frigate, a massive ship that is, by the way, interestingly limited to 1 per faction. This really is your kind of Death Star. But of course, to go along with that, the Air and Sand update also brought with it aerial combat. And by the way, you'll notice probably a few times, I'm gonna make some mistakes. This is the first time I've played a proper full game of Dune Spice Wars in quite a while, as you can tell by the theme of this video. And I think you can probably safely colour me impressed. The aerial combat units are, of course, immune to that of melee units. Of course, they can't be attacked from the ground. You'll also note that ornithopters can be attacked now too, and demo units can deal damage to aerial units. So there's now really more of a rock, paper, scissors effect at play in the combat system. However, they didn't just stop with combat, oh no siree Bob, they also added new resources, new buildings, and a new way to equip our units, a new equipment system. And so they're adding detail, layer on layer, right the way down. The new resources, guild favour and machine scrap, are all of the factions' ways at engaging with a new expense system, essentially, that's used to deploy the spaceships. Most factions will use guild favour, however the Fremen, by destroying mechanical units and pillaging, will be able to gather scrap themselves to build airships. Of course, sticking with the underlying theme of Dune Spice Wars, and it's something that they of course do very well throughout all of these updates. I have, since playing this game, slightly dipped my toes into the wider fandom. I've enjoyed it. And of course, I've started to appreciate the game just those little bit more around the edges. Speaking of the edges, though, they were completely blown apart by the new major buildings, which smacked their way into the middle. Just to say, hey, I know this is an air and sand update, but don't forget about the ground gameplay as well. And as you can see on screen, the new major buildings are limited to one per faction. Everyone aside from the Fremen gets a spacing guild branch, which allows them to deploy their spaceships, exchange resources for guild favours, that resource we talked about earlier, and unlock new proposals. The Fremen, on the other hand, get their own recycling plant, allowing them to work with their scrap. There are also two more massive buildings, one of them an experimental alloy furnace, which is all about money, baby, at the cost of plascrete, something I dare say I'm gonna need in this game. And then lastly, also a military factory, plus 25% power to military batteries and an extra one with some range on the region as well. All in all, if you are familiar with Dune Spice Wars, then you'll probably think, hey, those were some fairly significant additions to the game, and you'd be right. If you're not, and you're thinking, geez, that was a lot of detail, well, let me take a step back for just a little bit. Because inside of each of these updates that have come to Dune Spice Wars, and by my calculations, roughly one every 2 months, with some kind of acknowledgement or written update from the developers in between, they've also taken a sweeping change across kind of every other aspect of the game, and by that I mean specifically the AI, the quality of life improvements, and the user interface. The AI continues to receive improvements. At the start of the game, it was quite easy to bully it very early on in the access. My understanding is now it has gotten a lot better, although as I mentioned at the start of the video, I really need to try that out a little bit more seriously myself. I think I need to get a few more games under my belt before I can comment any further, but the quality of life improvements have blown me away as well, just in the small time that I've played. I won't go into each and every single one of them right here, right now, because I'd also like to address something that will start to also be coming up on your screen, and that's the Line in the Sand update. The holidays update that released for Dune Spice Wars. This one took a slightly different approach, but was just as significant. Instead of focusing on new features, new buildings, new air warfare, for example, this one said, hey, we're just going to improve every single thing in the game, how do you like me now? From the addition of in-game statistics, a nice touch, military alerts, this one I noticed straight away and fell in love with. They now appear at the border of the screen, moving around as you move around, really clearly in your face. And more importantly, I can also lock my units down, holding their position with C, and preventing some of the frustrations that you might see occur in a slightly newbie gameplay, not at all playing at the moment on your screen. Also in this update, they continue to push out major performance improvements and optimization, and from the limited reading that I did across the forums to try and gauge a little bit of perspective in the Discord as well on how it's performing, it seems to be fairly good reviews across the board. Dune Spice Wars, for the record, was never something that particularly struggled on my system in the first place. However, I note there are now new options to launch the game and a whole load of back-end changes behind the scenes to get this puppy running ever smoother. And considering it's still in early access, I don't think you'll find many people who will have significant performance issues with Dune Spice Wars. At least not too many in the streams and the chats that we had particularly early on. The other major changes that came in the Line in the Sand update were around map generation. Map generational improvements, main bases and deep desert spawning has changed, and the spice spawning has changed as well, to ensure less spiceless starts. Across the board, these quality of life improvements that were drawn out on the beach when they cast their line through the sand have done a really good job to shape Dune Spice Wars. With a slight time jump incoming, I wanted to focus on these guys, the barracks, the units, and the many changes that came to them as well. Take a look. Handguns, better protections, food additives, to name a few. Additional bags, why not? And of course, this is on top of the other systems that support and supplement combat in Dune Spice Wars. Take the espionage missions, for example. Combat drugs, buffing my units, and defensive sabotages. Weakening enemy missile batteries are just a couple of the tools that I'll use in the arsenal that Dune Spice Wars allows you to build. And I think that the two most recent major updates, particularly the first Air and Sand update, have done a wonderful job at adding new layers to the combat system in Dune Spice Wars. Because initially, in the early phases of the early access, it was a really enjoyable game, of course, don't get me wrong, but the combat was much more limited. Essentially, you have your ground units, some of them are ranged and some of them are not. Some do splash damage and some have armor. And after that, aside from supply differences and a few other nuances, there wasn't really much else to it. But with the addition of these new airborne protections, as well as more protections on the land, and then the ability to upgrade my troops and really fine-tune their abilities and their powers, you can see how Dune Spice Wars is adding more intricate layers of combat on top. Now, does that mean that this is going to be a successful and blindly reckless early siege-filled game? Well, for me in this case, in part, but more broadly, I think it's done a wonderful job to shape combat, not just in single player, but in multiplayer as well. I haven't played a lot of multiplayer. I'm too busy, as you can see, sitting here buying shares in the market. These puppies will pay off. Another somewhat new addition into Dune Spice Wars. The multiplayer setting, though, has received a lot of general improvements. Unlimited multiplayer pause is now an option, so you don't need to worry about old Tim who takes too long in the loo. New players conceding are now replaced by AI, so blank space left empty is now occupied. As my ornithopter gets shot down, I didn't know that could happen. Thirdly, in the multiplayer improvements, if your last opponents are only AIs that have replaced humans, then you instantly win, but more importantly, you can join a lobby using its private code now as well. Really, in my opinion, opening up the multiplayer, the fairly good and robust system that they already had, and now allowing everyone to kind of join in and play with it how they like. Now, in this video, as you may remember from the start, I'm playing in the fast-paced 2v2 mode. And this game, while I did definitely finish it a little more prematurely than before, I played on 2x speed throughout, slower than the previous max speed, I would note, since the last time I played considerably. But despite that, I finished up in, I think, around perhaps 35 or 40 minutes of total recording, minus a couple of jump skips. Here we are in a 23-minute video. And I really like that. Because again, while you add those new combat changes in, you add new layers. But by adding new game modes, we also get different ways to play. And that's crucial, because now you have a way to jump in, a quick game, 1v1, take them down, or jump into a longer form campaign. However, there is more to come. Alongside their regular patch updates, they also provide the ones that I find even more juicy. It's those look to the future ones. Hey, these are the next big things that we're bringing out. And I think that these updates are particularly special with Dune Spice Wars. And I want to give a huge shout out and kudos to anybody who's a part of this process with them, who's working on this. Because, in my opinion, they are one of the best at communicating what they want to do, and crucially, delivering on that. There is nothing worse than making big promises and not being able to meet them. Particularly, I think, as fans of games when we're really invested in something. You know, we really want to play it and we're really keen to see how it's changing. Or maybe we just want to get a return on our bottom line. Either way, back to Dune Spice Wars, let's take a look at what its future holds. Because recently, they've signaled some pretty exciting things. Not only new features, but also changes to existing ones, new game modes. In case you can't tell, they're fairly ambitious. In their December community update, the first thing that they did was say, hey look, we have some immediate focuses that we want to work on right now, and this is what our devs are focused on. Things like updating the counselors, an important part of each faction, adding more military gear that we looked at before, changing generations of the map, and some other things that you'll notice on this list, like in-game statistics that have already been implemented. And that's because these targets were released just before that major patch update, the Line in the Sand update, came out last month in January of 2023. So as you can see, not only are they promising, but clearly they can prove that they're capable of delivering. Other things on the list I would note include tutorial missions, new skills and abilities for military units, further adding to them, as well as improvements to the tech tree, development improvements, new discoveries on the map, and perhaps a victory condition rework and overhaul, just to throw a grenade right at the end of that list. That one sounds like it could be incredibly significant. However, on the backdrop of talking about that, they also want to note that they have tons more fixes, improvements, performance changes, that kind of thing in the works. So clearly they're looking at gameplay features, but also looking at shoring up the core experience. However, they didn't just stop there, because that kind of discussion is what you would expect from here's what's coming in the next patch or two kind of updates. We've seen many of those here on the channel, and of course that's exactly what it read like. But if I cast my mind back to when Dune Spice Wars came out into early access, I think it was April 2022, they released a roadmap. And it had a few images on it, and it said, these are our big targets, these are the things we want to add to the game, and these are the things that you should expect. And recently, in that December information burst, they released an updated version of it. Let's take a look at it on screen. So, as you can see, multiplayer, gotcha, new faction, you bet, air and sand, oh boy! And then previously, the next one was going to be the one that's currently last on the list. Heroes of Dune and more, kind of adding more characters into the game, like the counselors, who have more of an impact in the actual real-time strategy experience, instead of selecting them as kind of buffs or debuffs at the start of the game, as well as other things, I believe. Very powerful, potentially, combat units. They've said, hey, actually, we're going to push that back a little bit and add something new. The Conquest mode. Remember at the start of the video when we talked about there being 2 game modes, now soon to be 3? Well, that Conquest mode has really taken their attention. As they said in their update, at the start of 2023 they're going to be releasing more updates, more information detailing the changes, but also talking about that Conquest mode. A direct quote, "Following an outpour of requests from our players for a campaign/story mode since launch, we have decided to change up our roadmap slightly and shift our focus to developing Conquest mode as our next major update." So there you go, they're shifting it ahead in the pipeline, and Dune Spice Wars looks to be getting a story to it. And we talked a little bit about story earlier on in the video. Oh my gosh, it's as if he thought ahead. So now there's an additional layer coming to Dune Spice Wars, a more single-player focused, campaign and story-like experience. I don't yet fully have a huge amount of information on it, so I won't bother perhaps speculating on it too much in this video, although I'll be watching and waiting for the next update. Speaking of which though, they did signal a little bit more. As you can see on your screen, right down the bottom of the list, at the very end they said, hey look, we've got lots of ideas, we're in the early stages of production with them. Over the course of Dune Spice Wars, before the full release, we've got lots more we'd like to do. This includes things like spectator modes, UI scaling, accessibility, co-op, modding options, map options. I mean, the list just doesn't stop. And that could almost be the theme of this entire discussion. It just doesn't stop, and in a really good way. Now, don't get me wrong, of course there are imperfections, rough edges, things that could be added to make Dune Spice Wars better or an overall more enjoyable game. However, if the theme of this video has taught you anything, I'd hope that the takeaway should be that this is a really impressive early access development for a game that launched very well, and while there was a little bit of criticism around the edges, it almost resisted it entirely, and has throughout its early access lifecycle proven to be a hot topic. I note that I believe in November of last year, Dune Spice Wars also released on Game Pass, which kind of, I guess, brings me, as that unit gets swallowed by a worm, towards the end of the video, and towards perhaps the end of this gameplay as I target the Fremen base, because of course that is our victory condition if we're going for domination in Dune Spice Wars. Is Dune Spice Wars a recommendable experience? I'd encourage you here, by the way, if you've watched this far through, firstly, you're a legend. Watch time is king in the YouTube world, and you are now my favourite person. But secondly, and more importantly, I'd love it if you could comment below. Comment below? I'm going to leave that in. Comment below and share your experiences, new or old, with Dune Spice Wars and its development. I'd be especially keen to hear about it over the last few months, because my closing thoughts here around Dune Spice Wars are that this is an absolutely easy recommend. If someone came up to me and said, what's a great real-time strategy game for me to play? I could reach to the classics, of course. I could lean into something, I don't know, Age of Empires or whatever, take your pick. But Dune Spice Wars has to be at the top of the list for me. even in its early access state, and that is something I think quite rare. Dune Spice Wars takes the early access fears that many players may have been scarred by and throws them aside. It says, yeah, I'm an early access experience, sure I'm still developing, but watch me go. Watch me do a fantastic job, and crucially, let me bring you along with it. Let me take you along this ride. And so whether you're purchasing it on Steam or thinking about it, or maybe, as I believe, playing it for free, included of course with the price of your Xbox Game Pass with PC subscription, I think that Dune Spice Wars is almost certainly a must pick up for strategy gamers, regardless, I would yet again add, of your love or hate, if that is your thing, of the Dune franchise. Speaking of the Dune franchise, I would also note that there were announcements towards the end of last year around the franchise receiving more video games, and not a strategy game either. The next one, a completely different genre, something more action or RPG inspired, to pull in a different flair, a different type of player, or potentially you as well. I will probably check it out just because I've played Dune Spice Wars. That's how good Dune Spice Wars has been. I intend to cover Dune Spice Wars a bit more on the channel moving forward. However, I won't make any promises. The games catalogue for 2023 keeps getting bigger. My personal library keeps getting bigger, and it is difficult to juggle all of these things. But I do intend to keep watering this garden, and I hope that you'll join me in this wonderful journey as we demolish their base somewhat aggressively and with loads of misplays along the way. Please don't flame me, and take the victory in Dune Spice Wars. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all next time. Take care.